Welcome to another episode of Writer on the Road. It's episode number 4 in our series, and I've got with me today a very, very special guest. Her name is, by chance, Melinda Hammond. Now, Melinda and I have had a chance to chat, and we both agree that we're both infamous and we both have very important names. But unfortunately, Melinda's been writing since 1980 and she has a lot more novels under her belt than me. So in this particular instance, I'm going to step back and hand over to the expert. But before I do, I'd like to go through a little bit of an introduction that I found. And it was a quote by, I guess, someone who publishes Melinda, I'm not sure, by Single Titles. And it says, "Melinda is one of the brightest stars in the Regency firmament. Her plots are fast-paced, her characterisation impeccable, and her ability to evoke the past in a vivid and colourful way, superb." Okay, welcome, Melinda, to Writer on the Road. What do you say about that very wonderful quote?
That is it. It is a wonderful quote. It's from a website that reviews Regency and historical novels, and quite clearly they like the ones that I write. So that's quite useful. Um, it's very good when you write something that obviously hits the spot and people relate to it. I'm a great fan of Georgette and Jane Austen, and absolutely love their books. So that's the style that I write in, and obviously luckily someone agrees, a reviewer agrees, which is great news for me. Very, very affirming.
Yeah, and you said you write in the style of Georgette and that she inspired you, and I also noticed Jane Austen, and Melinda and I were talking before we recorded this, and ever since I've been a little girl, I read the Georgette novels. I've studied Jane Austen throughout my academic career, and as soon as I picked up one of Melinda's novels last night to read, it was called Winter Inheritance. It took me right back to those days where I had nothing else in my life to do but read beautiful romance novels. Everything that I've picked up about you, Melinda, is romantic. I'm sitting here looking at her now. Beautiful blonde-haired lady, beautiful English drawing room, bookshelves in the background. Melinda, you've created a persona for yourself, but I'm guessing it's also the real you. Would you like to talk to us about your love of romance?
Oof, I'd love to think it was the real me as well. It must be a facet. I don't think it can all be false, but I've always loved romance. It's escapism. Everybody needs a certain amount of escapism in their lives, I think. And it's just the sort of books that I've always wanted to write. And I'm lucky enough to live in a very romantic part of the world, up on the Yorkshire moors, literally in a stone's throw from Haworth, where the Brontes lived and wrote their books. So very much Wuthering Heights country, which is great. We live up on the moors in an old farmhouse, so I can go out, I can walk on the moors. Literally, I don't have to drive anywhere. I just take the dog out, go for a walk over the moors when I want inspiration, which is wonderful. For this other world, this 18th and 19th century England, which is the world I like to write about.
Now, Melinda and I again have already talked about the difference in our temperatures, but we both agree that it's 18 degrees where she is and 18 degrees where I am in Brisbane, Australia. But she's in the middle of summer and I'm in the middle of winter. Now, you're out walking on the moors at the moment, Melinda. How beautiful would that be at this time of year?
It's incredibly beautiful. We have curlews and lapwings nesting up in the fields. And then when the sun comes out, which it does occasionally, the skylarks are singing during the day, which is beautiful. So there is, we also can have the bad weather, and the cloud can come down and the wind and the rain. So it's not all brilliant. You have to be a bit hardy as well. A good pair of boots, I think, and a raincoat are essential. but it's a lovely place to live, and it's so good to be able to get out and just let your brain wander away into another world, and just leave the cares of this modern one behind, even if it's only for a while.
Yeah. When you're out there and you're walking, there seems to be a tendency now for writers to use, I guess, technology to help them get their stories down faster and faster. But I'm wondering, in the world that you describe, that you still do it the old fashioned way, that you still think your stories through and you come home and you get them down? Or are you one of these people that carry a recorder in your pocket?
No, I actually hate the sound of my voice. If I record it, I can't listen to it afterwards. I don't like listening to myself, the recorded version. Um, so I tend to think up the story. I'm actually there. The I don't know whether you've heard it, but the terms plotter and pantser is two sorts of writers. The pantser writes by, it's like you're flying by the seat of your pants. You set off, you're never sure where you're actually going, and you're not sure if it's going to work, and you just hope it does. That's my type of writing. The other type is the plotter who goes through, sets everything down perfectly, knows where the story is going every step of the way. I never know that. I always know it's going to be a happy ending, but how they're going to get there, I rarely know. And that's what the walking does. It sorts the bits out in my head. And then I come home and type it. I used to write onto paper with shorthand, but now I type, usually go straight onto the computer, which saves some time.
Mm.
But the stories, it's sometimes they're just bubbling in your head, and you just have to get it onto paper, so or onto a computer screen, really.
Mm. That leads me, and I'm sure we all want to know the answer to this. This is a lady who's been writing since 1980, and we'll take you through that journey shortly. How long each day do you spend working?
Oh, I have actually, I've tried to be a bit scientific and time this occasionally. I don't think I do more than 4 hours actual writing, because if you turn the timer off every time you get up to do something, or you get interrupted, or you go onto the internet and check Facebook or Twitter, you'd be surprised how much of a day you can lose. I tend to try and keep office hours. Um, so I get up and start working either 8 or 9 o'clock, um, and finish. Sometimes I can go on till 5 or 6, but very often there's time taken out for research, for reading, for checking facts and figures and things. So I do work a full day, a full 8, 9 hours a day, but sometimes you probably find it as well. That thing called the internet can be quite seductive at taking up your time, which is quite naughty. And then, of course, the dog has to be walked, and the phone has to be answered. So
Yeah.
it's
Melinda let us in on a little secret. Her husband actually works away some of the time, so she has an advantage over, I guess, some of us in that she doesn't have to worry about him coming home. But having said that, I'm guessing when he is home, he may take up more of your time than maybe would otherwise be expected, perhaps.
um, I think we try to make the most of the time we're together. So I think from that point of view, it works very well. It I think for any writer, you have to shut yourself away, don't you? You have to be a bit organised. So if he was home more often, I would have to just close the door on the office and say, now is my writing time.
Yeah.
So,
And I
so
think that's something that we all need to remember. In order to succeed, we need to dedicate time, and not just a little bit of time. Like Melinda, it's a real job. I think there's a book by Steve Pressfield called Turning Pro. If we're serious about the writing game, then we have to give it priority. And I think there's a lot of stuff floating around the internet at the moment that makes me cross, that says you can write a book in 30 days, you can do this wonderful thing in 2 weeks,
mm,
writing kids' books is easy. And I'm going, from where I'm sitting, I think it's really hard work and you really have to dedicate your time and your mind to it. Do you find when you're doing your research and you're doing your writing that you don't churn things out and send them off quickly, that it actually takes, I guess, a fermentation period where you work really hard at it when you're waking, when you're sleeping, and when you're out walking?
Yes, yeah, definitely. You can't. I don't think you can just dash off a book. You might have the story in your head, but when you get it onto the paper, the grammar, the punctuation, the actual story itself has to be polished so that the reader understands what you are trying to say. Um, because sometimes the words that are in your head aren't the words that get down onto the page, and you have to hone that to make it the best possible story that you can. And sometimes that can take several drafts. And if you can put it away, it's always a great idea. It's something that I tell new writers all the time. If you've got time to put the book away for a few weeks and then come back to it, you can look at it with fresh eyes then, and you can see the flaws in the story much better, and also the typos, the actual practical physical process of producing a good piece of literature, which is quite important. Even though I write very light romance, it's still important that the writing is good, because if there's problems, for me anyway, if the writing isn't good, it pulls me out of a story, very much so.
And there's so much focus on, I guess, indie publishing nowadays, but you started in the 80s. You've been writing
Yes.
now for 35 years, 36 years. It's
Oh,
scary, isn't
I
it?
think I've been writing since I was a teenager, but I was published first in the 80s.
Yep.
So I think I've always written. I think it was one of those things. At school, I would always write. And make up stories before that. I remember sitting in the playground with my friends making up stories for them. So I'm a storyteller rather than a literary writer. I am a storyteller, but you have to get that over. So you have to you have to know your craft of writing and language, which is fairly important, I think, for communication. So yeah, it's and when I started, you had to find a publisher if you wanted to get out there. And I was very lucky that I found Robert Hale first of all, who published my Georgian and Regency novels. And since then, I've published with other publishers and moved on to Harlequin, Mills and Boon. But now, for my Regencies, I'm tending to go towards the indie. I'm republishing my backlist, the books that were published by Robert Hale. Now I'm putting those out myself. Winter Inheritance is one of those that was published originally by Robert Hale. But being historicals, they don't date the same as contemporary books. So, and there is still a market for the Regency and Georgian novels, which is great, and all sorts of Georgian romance and Regency romances, from the very hot to what they call the sweet traditional Regencies, which tend to be my Melinda Hammonds. They tend to be more sweeter, sweet romances, clean romances. There's several titles for them.
Yeah. I
So.
think the one I was reading last night, and even listening to you, I have so many questions. So if I jump around a bit, I have to apologise. Uh,
Oh, we'll have to do it again. We must we'll do it more often.
Yeah. Well, I was reading last night about Rafe and Verity in Winter Inheritance, Mr.
Yeah.
Bannerman and Miss Shaw. Now, I fell in love, of course, with Rafe, as one must immediately. It was very clear from the
Yes.
outside that your baddies were baddies and your goodies were goodies. Talk to me
Yes.
about the research process that goes into these novels.
Oh, research. I've been doing research for decades of the Georgian and Regency period in England. So that's where I'm most comfortable. But every time I do a novel, I have to read I have to find more. There's always a few details that I need to check up on or read more about. A lot of it comes from historical novels that or sorry, historians, historical books, history books, non-fiction books that I've read over the years. Little gems that you pick up that you don't think are going to have anything interesting in, and then you find a little point that you enjoy. And with the internet, there's an awful lot more information now. A lot of newspapers have been digitized, the old ones. There's one called the Georgian newspaper project, which is Bath newspapers from the 18th century have been all recorded now, and they're all online for anybody to go in and have a look. All the information is there, and you can pick up lovely little snippets in there of information, and then you just follow that up with research, the old way of going to libraries or getting books, and maybe stuff on the internet as well, looking that up. But I love the research part. The problem comes stopping the research and starting the book. But it's very much a background for my characters. I like the history to be correct, but I don't want it to take over. I'm not writing historical novels about real people. So the history is the background. It's the tapestry, and I weave my story and my characters onto that tapestry.
Yeah, and that came through very clearly in Winter Inheritance. I was walking down the street with the characters. I was seeing, I guess, the shops, although I don't think you called them shops in those days, the mills and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was very much a background, and I'm guessing that's a skill that you've honed over all those years of writing. You do it effortlessly. When it comes to your research, just before we let that go, your website says you have always had a love of history. You've spoken about how you do it. What's your advice to someone setting out how to control that research process and not let it take over your writing?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult one. You have to avoid information dump. It's very easy, especially for new writers, to do that. You get so involved in your subject that you suddenly find yourself, you could write pages and pages on one little point, but if it doesn't move the story forward, probably it can go. You have to explain. The thing about history is your reader may not be familiar with some of the terms that you use, so you have to make it plain what you're talking about, but you don't have to go into reams of detail. You tend to, what you're writing is a story, and the story has to move on without boring your reader. That's the main thing. If they're interested in the history, they'll do what I did when I was young and I read historical novels. They will then go out and read the history of it. And if your novel's good enough, it will stand up and they will say, yes, that's right. That's the feeling I got from it. But we're also creating a world that doesn't exist. So there's a fine line between the fantasy and the history. I don't really think readers of my novels would want their heroines to have no teeth by the time they're 40, or to smell the smells that probably were around in an age that didn't wash that much. Or even when you go back to the Regency time, the Georgian times, and they had their hair put up with pig's lard and held into place with big false hair pieces and things, and then they would sleep with it up like that and have to have combs, special sticks to get right into the head to scratch where the lice were itching. That's not romance. That's not romance. So it's nice to know, but it's not really the story that I'm telling.
Yeah, and remember, for all of you out there listening, choose your details wisely.
That's a good one. I shall remember that one. Yes.
Yeah, I want to pick up on, and again, jumping around, you mentioned the word indie publishing, which is very dear to my heart. And the
Yeah.
reason I've started this podcast is because I've been an English teacher forever. And it's very important to me that everybody has the opportunity to get their stories out, but in a way that is professional. Now, you've come from a traditional background, and I'm assuming you will continue to publish traditionally, but you're also making a move into that indie publishing. Can you take us back and tell us what made you make that decision and where you think it's going to take you?
Um, the the beauty of indie publishing is the freedom it gives you to publish what you really want to do. And much as I love writing my books for Harlequin, Mills and Boon, but there are other books that wouldn't fit into that Sarah Mallory mould. My Sarah Mallory books tend to be more about the romance. The history is the background, but it's the main. There's two main characters. With indie publishing, you can expand slightly, maybe have more characters, things that aren't quite so commercially viable for a mainstream publisher. And publishers these days, there are so many people writing. It's even for established writers, it's difficult if you want to break out and do something slightly different. I've done a couple of books that are contemporary and historical, a mix of dual time stories. Not quite time slip, but maybe ones with more of like a slightly paranormal, ghostly element. Getting those published by a mainstream, if you have a formula that works as a writer and your name is known for one thing, sometimes publishers aren't very keen on taking a risk. Whereas with indie publishing, you can, because you're the one taking the risk. You're not risking all the investment that a publisher, a traditional publisher, will put in. So it's an exciting time, but there's a lot of people out there in the market. That's one of the problems. It's the beauty of it, and also the problem that there are so many people now publishing their own stories, and it's lovely that they're all out there. So yeah, it's an exciting time for writers, I think, and for the publishing industry.
And look, I've heard some horror stories, and mainly through reading blog posts and listening to podcasts and listening to writers talk about how traditional publishers aren't releasing their backlists and not allowing writers to move forward in their own way. And then we've got the whole story of hybrids of people traditionally publishing and in indie publishing different titles. Is it more power to the author nowadays, that we have, or you have, more negotiating power than you used to have?
Oh, I personally, I wouldn't think there's more negotiating power. The publishers, they're still, the market is changing, I feel, and they are still feeling their way forward in a world that suddenly saw the ebook and the explosion of ebooks coming onto the market. One of the things that the advantages it has, if you're traditionally published, or it should have, is quality. If you have a traditional publisher, if a reader buys a book from a traditional publisher, they should be able to feel fairly confident that it's gone through an editing process. So they should be fairly sure that the quality of writing they're getting is reasonable. With indie publishing, anyone can put up a book these days, can publish their own book if they can use a computer, or if they have a friend who can use a computer, they can publish their own book, and the quality can vary. So readers, I know quite a few readers now who won't buy authors unless they're recommended to them, because they've tried so many in the past and been disappointed. And let's face it, life is too short to read a bad book. If you pick up a book, or even an ebook on Kindle or whatever, You want to be transported to another world, and the writing has to be reasonably good for that. And I'm maybe it's old school, but I think the language and the grammar has to be reasonably good as well. It has to carry the reader away into that new world. So.
And I think that's something that we're trying to address as indie authors and traditional authors, is making sure that that standard is maintained. I know with me, I pay an editor, I pay a cover designer, I pay to make sure that my books are the very best that they can be. And I listen to professional indie authors out there, and they actively encourage everyone to make sure that their content is of the highest standard, because it has been a problem in the past. And although indie publishing offers us all the freedom in the world, without a good book, none of the rest of it matters.
That's true. It's the writing is the important. It, for me, is very important, and most of the successful authors that I know who've moved from traditional into indie, into self-publishing or indie publishing, will always say, even those who've been published for decades, will say it has to be edited. You need to. It's worth paying a professional editor to edit your work, because it's very difficult for an author. You are so close to your work when you've written it. It's very difficult to actually see the faults as an editor will. Even if it's just the grammar and syntax and everything, you do need it to be edited to make the book as good as it can be. You're right.
Yeah, and I'm finding myself trying to keep a low profile as an English teacher, because a lot of what I'm reading in the blogs and in the posts is that I would have been a writer much sooner, but my English teacher turned me against it. And I'm going,
Really?
yeah.
Oh, really? No, I didn't find that at all. I mean, maybe it's some teachers are not as good as others. Who knows? I found my English teacher, or the English teachers I had, gave us quite a good grounding in grammar. And the history teacher gave me a love of history that made me want to read more about it and learn more about it. And it just seemed natural to combine the two. You know, I think you need the good grounding in English before you can write a good story. If you can't communicate, you can't tell the story.
Yeah, and I'm finding, I don't know what it's like in England, but here in Australia, there is a pushback to traditional grammar, and it's actually taught explicitly through lesson after lesson after lesson. You need to know your nouns and verbs, and you need to know your conjunctions, because it's been forgotten, and it runs a very real risk with modern technology of texting and all those kinds of things, that those old-fashioned skills don't matter. But as writers, they're our tools of the trade. And I'm groaning even as you and I are talking, because I'm thinking I'm alienating some of my listeners even as I say this stuff. But if there's one thing that I can put out, and you're saying as well, get your content right.
Yes, I totally agree. It's communication, and the written word is a form of communication that needs to be right, because you need to get the story over and to paint that picture in the best way you can. I suppose if you're going to use, or if I'm going to use the painting analogy, then there are different ways of, you have the Impressionists and Cubists and goodness knows what else. But I just think, like you, that the grammar and the basis of the writing is important. It tends to be, if the story is good enough, you can get away with the odd thing, and sometimes it's a writing style that people have, but that doesn't mean that the English should be bad. Maybe I'm old school on that, I don't know, but I just think it is important. And you're right, with texting and computers, a lot of it can be lost. But the English language, or any language, develops. It's always developed, we will take on the modern idioms of the social media and things, and it will be incorporated. But it's the communication, and occasionally friends of mine put up little sentences with no commas in, and wherever you insert those commas can make things sound, it can totally alter the meaning of the sentence. And you find that when you're reading sometimes. I read for, in England, the UK's Romantic Novelists Association, and we have a new writers scheme where authors can submit their work, and we read and we critique it, and try and help them to produce a better book and to get published. And some writers, they're very good, but you can see that with a little bit more honing, they could be a lot better. And sometimes when you're reading it, and we do it ourselves as well, sometimes there are complete howlers in the writing. So, yeah, I am all for grammar and English and communication. Get it right. So
Yeah. And when when you were talking there, it seems that you're very involved in mentoring and giving back to new writers coming through behind you. That appears to be something that I've noticed, is that writers are so very, very generous.
yes, it's certainly amongst the romantic novelists that I know. I've been a member of the Romantic Novelists Association since I started. I was published in the 80s. And I've always found everyone is so generous with their time and their information, the sharing of knowledge. You would think that we would be very much competitors, but everyone is very generous and helpful, and we have the most amazing parties as well, which is. I suppose we have the advantage living in England that it's small and we can get there. In Australia, you're probably a bit further away, maybe it's more difficult to meet up. But yes, I do find writers are very generous with their information and the telling, helping you to succeed. So.
Yeah, and I think with anyone new coming through, and I'm actively reaching out to new writers to say, it's okay to tell your story. We want you to tell your story, and we want you to tell it in the best way you know how. And everybody is out there, I guess, to help you succeed. Once upon a time, once you got a couple of rejections, that was it. You wouldn't try any further. But there is the indie publishing route now. But again, it's so important that you surround yourself with a network that helps you be the best writer that you can be. I'm going to sneak something in here that I thought we'd get to much earlier, but I'm aware that I've taken up nearly an hour of your time. I just wanted to ask you, Melinda, about branding. You are very clearly a Regency Romance writer. How closely do you protect that Melinda Hammond brand and that Melinda Hammond romantic author brand? Because coming through now, new writers have to create a brand from scratch.
I've never really thought too much about it. I do think now I might have to take another name if I do more serious historical novels, as opposed to the Regency and Georgian. I think I might use another name for it, because one does get branded, and now people will know. They readers expect a certain thing from authors. I think these days, it used to be, well, maybe some authors still do write very varied books, and the readers will stick with it. But mainly, if you write a book that's slightly different, a reader can be disappointed, because they pick your book up expecting one type of story, and if they get something else. It's one of the reasons I chose to write for Harlequin, Mills and Boon under the name Sarah Mallory, because those books, they're a little bit racier. They're slightly different style, not a great deal. I love writing them, and they're not that different, but they are slightly different, and they tend to go beyond the bedroom door, shall we say? Whereas most of my Melinda Hammonds don't. Some do. It depends on the story. I find it depends very much on the story, how hot the story gets. It depends on the characters. But I do think that the Melinda Hammond, Georgian and Regencies now, I have done so many, and they are a definite style. So I shall probably carry on and keep that as a brand now.
Yeah, and look, I've got to tell you, I just love it when I flick through all your novels on Amazon, and there's my poor little miner's wife sitting up in the middle of the romance novels, and I'm thinking, that's not quite right. And look, I'm very much in the process of rebranding as Writer on the Road, and I've got a series of romance novels because I've travelled so much in Australia, and they're around Australia in 8 romances. But it's certainly not going to be under Melinda Hammond. I'm thinking of going for Mel Hammond just to separate us a little bit.
Yeah. Mel Hammond sounds good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, if you're starting out, you need to take these things into consideration, which obviously I never did, I just blundered in. But it's very important to get that branding right. Otherwise, you need to, like I am, start again, or think a little bit more carefully before you start out, whether it be a blog, whether it be a website, whether it be a podcast, although I don't recommend anybody goes that way. It's very, very technical, and I'm guessing with a weekly interview it's going to take up an awful lot of my life. But the benefits are I get to talk to people like Melinda, and even through you and I chatting, you've given so much information and you've been so very, very generous that anybody who's starting out can't help but listen to you talk and take away some things to think about with their own writing. And when I finish here tonight, I'll make some notes in our transcript to highlight some of the things that you've given us today, so that next time we talk, we can cover some other aspects of the writing life. We've only touched base today, but we are up to an hour, give or take some of our interruptions, and I knew it would happen. But I'm going to do it. I'm sorry. Bear with me 5 more minutes. I started reading Winter Inheritance. I downloaded it specifically for this interview. And then when I looked inside, I noticed it had originally been written in 2004. But of course, I'd downloaded the 2016 edition. And I went, oh, I wanted to have your newest one so I could talk about it. I didn't want to talk about an old one. And then I looked and I thought, hang on, I've downloaded a boxed set of yours. And I went back to my box set on my Kindle, and it was the Regency Quintet, which, lo and behold, one of the Regency Quintet was...
The Four Seasons, yeah.
Okay. So I now have 2 copies of Winter Inheritance.
I'm very sorry about that. I retitled Winter Inheritance because it was originally The Highclough Lady,
Yes.
which when it was traditionally published was fine, but I did have a lot of people, we hadn't long moved to Yorkshire in those days when I first published it, and it was set up here on the Yorkshire moors, and a lot of people said, how do you pronounce Highclough, because of the spelling. And I thought, well, I could probably do with having a rebranded title anyway. And then I wanted to put some books together into a box set. So I changed it to Winter Inheritance just so that I could add it into those 4 Regency seasons. But the box set's such good value that I hope you don't feel shortchanged on it.
Oh, I love it. I've been caught out by Nora Roberts for years, and I love Nora
Yeah,
Roberts. I buy everything that she
yeah,
puts out, whether it be a
yeah.
mystery or whether it be her romances. She is one lady that writes, I guess, very in the moment romances, and she's very sparing with her words, and I take her as a bit of a guru, like you. And right from day one, I could buy a book released in 2015 or 16, but it was originally published in 1985, and I go, oh, why does this happen? But it's happening more and more, and I suggest to any of our readers out there that if you're buying a book, look in the inside cover, see actually when the copyright is, so you
Yeah.
know what you're buying. But what I want to throw to you now, Melinda, what should I have downloaded to get some of your more recent things?
Oh, the thing about the Melinda Hammonds is that Robert Hale published them in the 80s, but they only published them in hardback. So they went into the libraries, but there were very, very few copies around, which is why I wanted to put them out again as ebooks to make a bigger, to get a bigger audience for them. Um, my I'm so busy writing the Sarah Mallory's at the moment that Melinda Hammond's tend to be. I'm still getting my backlist from Robert Hale out there for people. The next one to go out, I am actually writing a Christmas Regency though, which will go into an anthology with other writers at the end of this year. So that will be a brand new Melinda Hammond. And we put five of us put books together into a box set. So we have five authors, so readers of any of us buy the set, and they get four other authors that they can try. So it's
Yeah.
a nice way of getting your books out there. So this Christmas one will go out, and then after Christmas I shall probably put it out myself as a single ebook. Um, but it should say in there that it was originally published in the anthology. You're right, you need to look in the inside cover for to see when books were published before. But so many authors are now putting out their backlists, because if a book was published years ago, it will have had a small readership, a much smaller readership, by modern standards. So it's good to get the books out there and keep them out there, and pick up new readers. I mean, some of my readers weren't even born in 1980, so and
Uh,
the historicals are they just don't date. They stay the same. So
Yeah, I can assure every one of you listening to this that Winter Inheritance is my new favourite book, and Rafe or Mr. Bannerman is my new handsome hero. I have given up on men altogether, but now that I've met Rafe, I may come back and try a third marriage.
yeah,
But keep in mind that as a marketing strategy, what Melinda has told us is something we should all consider. A boxed set with a group of authors is something that is happening more and more in the indie publishing world, and it is a fantastic way of trying new authors in a way that's not overly expensive, but no ebooks are that expensive anymore. And the added advantage of ebooks that I've always found is as I travel around and as I live in my caravan and move from place to place, I can take as many books with me. I don't have to cart the thousands of boxes of books that I've always carted around in the past. I think more of us are used to ebook reading now, and we can sit on our trains and our buses, and nobody needs to know that we're reading the saucy bits, or no one needs to know that we're reading romance. Although I think the stigma of reading romance, I'm hoping, is long gone.
it's still there, but there is a big market in England. Romantic fiction is, I think, the biggest share of the reading market still, in its many forms. Because most books have romance in them. Even Wilbur Smith admitted that one of his books was a romance, and he is actually now a member of the Romantic Novelists Association. We asked him if he'd like to join us. He said as long as he didn't have to do anything, he'd join. But yeah, there is romance in almost every book you pick up these days, of some sort. It may not be the main story, the main thread of the story, but most books are the better for a little bit of love, I think.
Yeah. And I'm going to end on that note as we hit the hour and a half mark. Melinda has been such a wonderful, wonderful guest today. I or Melinda and I have talked, and we're going to try a little experiment. We're going to put snippets of this, heaven forbid we put the whole hour and a half up, of our interview on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, which I'll post up on my website, and we won't put all of it up because there's just too much in it for one sitting. But everything Melinda has given us today is a treasure and a gem, and we thank you, Melinda, for being such a great sport. Please, please come back and chat with me again, and I promise to keep it to the half hour that I said it would be.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and writers tend to talk on and on. So,
Yeah, but usually we've got a glass of champagne in our hands.
yes, that's true. That's
Oh,
true. That does help. Yeah, it is breakfast time over here, and I'm not quite that decadent most days. Not on
well,
working days, anyway.
well, I've heard that it's 5 o'clock somewhere, but it's certainly 5 o'clock here
Yes.
in tropical Queensland. Thank you. We will talk again, and to everyone out there, Melinda and I will be firm friends forever and ever, and I promise never to use her name in vain.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda, and we'll talk again.
We will talk again,
Okay,
definitely.
bye bye.
Bye.